going. Thank you for coming back after that absolute fucking train wreck the last time. I'm glad you did, because there is a little bit of context that you already have. So why even talk about this thing that happened 150 years ago? We are actually going to hit the 150th anniversary of the battle on June 25th. So it's a nice little timing, you know, hit a little milestone, put out a podcast episode for it. But I think that the number one thing about why look at the Battle of the Little Bighorn is our understanding of how the battle transpired, why it did, and ultimately the narrative that surrounded it has changed over time as people have investigated it, as things have become clearer, and it's taken a very long time for that to happen. It was a monumental moment in U.S. history because it was such a black eye, and the world found out about it on July 6th, 1876. The U.S. was in the middle of celebrating its centennial anniversary when the news broke that this battle had occurred, and the entire 7th Cavalry under George Armstrong Custer's command had been wiped out.
Can I ask a dumb question?
You can ask any question. None of them are dumb.
How long after it actually happened did they find out? What was the gap in time? Like, you're talking about how it's crazy that on after July 5th that they figured this out, they learned about this. Like, how long after are we talking?
Yeah, like what's a transmission of data? It's crazy to think, because right now obviously we're video chatting from miles and miles and miles apart, and it's immediate. But like then it had to have been how long?
About a week and a half.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I mean, it's a good amount of time.
That's a good period. That's a good chunk of time right there. That's crazy.
And the whole time while that expedition was out there, everybody was thinking just like, this is the easiest thing in the world. It's going to be not a problem at all. We're just going to go ahead and essentially round up all the remaining quote unquote hostile Lakota Sioux, throw them on the reservation, take care of that. It's going to be no problem. And then in the middle of the biggest party the U.S. has ever hosted to this point, you find out that 268 Americans had been killed, and essentially an entire command had been wiped out, which is unheard of.
And I think that makes sense, though, when you talk about, messages are sent by horse. Like, a week later, yeah, that makes sense.
But the thing is, Custer had journalists embedded with him. He brought at least one, and that guy got killed on the banks of the river. Reinforcements or the other parts of the column showed up 2 days after the battle, and they immediately took over the site and almost created like a crime scene. So that brings me to the second part of why even talk about this, right? Why is this interesting? So the battlefield site of where the Battle of the Little Bighorn took place is the only battlefield in the world that has markers showing exactly where people fell in combat. Not necessarily where they were buried, but where they fell, where they found the body. This has created a living crime scene that has been studied and archaeologically dug on essentially since it took place. So the understanding of how the order of the battle took place has changed over time because technology has changed, where we could do ground penetrating radar. Forensics, they have bones that they've dug up from the battlefield and pieced together, and essentially a model of what the average U.S. 7th Cavalry soldier was like. What was his life like? But the most important part is all the forensic evidence surrounding how things happened, right? So if you can match where bullet casings were found, what type they were, where other people were, where the bodies were, you can rebuild the whole battle. And they have. It's taken about 30 years to do so, but they have actually done it and created a digital twin of the entire battlefield where They've cataloged every artifact that's come up, where it was, where all the markers were, every little site they've cataloged, and they believe that they have a very good understanding of exactly how this all went down. And how it did exactly all go down is extremely interesting to me.
So you're telling me that they are able to replicate with a certain amount of precision where certain shots were taken from and where people fell, and if they were hit and then moved around and then died after that because of mortal wounds or something? Is that crazy to think or say?
No, because it's absolutely true. I'll give you an example. They have a rifle, a US Springfield trapdoor rifle, in as an artifact in the museum that they know they have provenance that took place in the battle. They have done essentially forensics on it where they fired the rifle and cataloged the primer imprints on the case. They have subsequently found at least 3 rifle cases on 3 different points throughout the battlefield that they definitively can tie to that particular rifle. So they knew the rifle was here, here, and here. The other interesting part was that it was recovered via native warriors, which means it had been taken from a fallen U.S. soldier, because there's no other way that the native warriors could have got a trapdoor like that at the time, potentially. But yeah, they absolutely know. They actually took the rifle to the spot where one of the casings was recovered, and they knew, like, I'm standing where this rifle was fired, which is unheard of in battlefield reconstruction.
That's pretty fire.
So the other thing that with forensics and why this is so interesting is we can pinpoint exact people. We can pinpoint where that person fell. We can pinpoint who that person was by their injuries. They've actually been able to definitively identify skeletal remains for multiple people. They found a mandible, essentially like a jaw, and they realized that this jaw, the way that its whole shape was and everything, they were able to conclusively tell that this was a mixed race person. This was Caucasian and Native. There's only one person associated with the battle that fits that description, who is Mitch Boyer, who was one of the lead interpreters for Custer's unit. I'll give you guys a very brief background, and the reason why I want to keep it brief is I want to get to the exciting part of this story, and there's so much information that's out there, and also for anybody listening, finding information on the lead up to this is very easy to do. I reference the podcast Lions Led by Donkeys every episode, and they have a excellent series on the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and they refer to Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer as a patron saint of donkeys. But why did this battle take place? The very, very, very short, reduced answer is colonialism, of course. This all starts with white people showing up and causing tension with indigenous populations that were there. It's just a ripple effect that is 200 plus years in the making. And it is actually interesting that this event took place nearly 200 years to the day of the King Philip's War, which we talked about during the Bridgewater Triangle episode. But more specifically, the reason why this took place between the U.S. government and the Lakota Sioux is the disputes over the Black Hills of South Dakota. The Black Hills of South Dakota were a spiritual land and place that was to be untouched, and there were 2 treaties between the U.S. government and the Lakota Sioux Nation. The first Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed in 1851, the second in 1868, and the battle took place in 1876. So we're talking 25 years of this bullshit, right? Of politicking and violence and trying to come to agreements and signing agreements and not upholding agreements. That was pretty much like the overarching principle of what the U.S. strategy was, we're just going to ignore the treaties, which obviously pissed off the natives who were a part of the treaty, right? So 25 years of tensions that were building led to a point of no return. Right before the battle in 1875, there were still politicking going on to try to resolve this. However, that really wasn't the goal of the United States. The goal of the United States was to somehow figure out how to go to war, and they were trying to figure out a way to justify that. An interesting part of this battle is that people knew each other. They have talked to each other in person before. There is intimate relationships with people on both sides of this. Sioux delegates traveled to Washington, D.C. in May of 1875 to try to persuade President Grant to honor native lands. The U.S. offered $25,000, which today is equivalent of about $500,000, to purchase the Black Hills, and also the Sioux would have to relocate to Oklahoma. That's a non-starter right there. You're going to take all of our land. That's much better. We are a Northern Plains people, and you're going to send us to essentially the desert in Oklahoma. So one of the delegates that was there, named Spotted Tail, said, "You speak of another country, but it is not my country. It does not concern me, and I want nothing to do with it. I was not born there. If it is such good country, you ought to send the white men now in our country there and let us alone." Translation: if it's so great, why don't you fucking move there? So that took place a year before this gunfight took place, right? So now the U.S. realizing that, okay, we can't essentially sign another treaty or negotiate into this, but we can't just start a war. We don't really have justification. How do we do that? In late 1875, so we're talking about Thanksgiving time, like November 1875, they declared that all natives need to report to reservations by January 31st of 1876 or be declared hostile and face military action. So you're talking Thanksgiving to the end of January to move your ass from wherever you are to fucking Oklahoma in the middle of the winter. It's an impossible task. Also, the news didn't get to the native populations for about a month, right? The U.S. has created a completely impossible task that will be able to legally justify them moving in with military activity.
So when you say that they were able to kind of find a way to make it happen and do so legally, do you mean that there was some sort of treaty or something that they were in talks with as far as the native individuals? Or is this just something that, like, as far as their law was considered legal at that point in time?
It's a very good question, and I'm going to answer this speaking about someone who does this as fun and not a historian. But I think it's a little bit of both, because there were two treaties, at least two treaties, the first and second treaties of Fort Laramie, that were completely ignored by the U.S. But now they're still in talks, so that's why the Sioux delegates went to D.C., was to try to negotiate for honoring the treaties that are already in place and honoring the native land that the U.S. on paper is supposed to be honoring, right? So they had to find a way, if you know you want to go to war, and just get all these Indians to the reservations and get them out with all the places where we want to go. It's going to get violent, but how do we do this so we don't really look like the bad guy? And that's where that decree of you have to move by January 31st, 1876, or become declared hostile. Because they're essentially saying, like, if you didn't adhere to this order, then you're telling us that you want to fight.
And what was the primary motivation?
Gold.
Gold.
There was gold discovered in the Black Hills. And this was global news when this happened. So, the world had known about U.S. westward expansion and the opportunities of gold in them there hills. The U.S. had a pretty good idea that gold was there, but ironically enough, in 1874, a army expedition led by George Custer went to the Black Hills and discovered gold and reported it back, and then there's the motivation. We want your land, we want you gone, and we're going to take the gold. Is essentially where it comes down to.
We want the land and we want the money. Get.
It's a universal concept in global politics of securing the bag. There's so many examples throughout history of why people do certain things, especially with despotic governments where things get really funny, where it's like failed states and stuff. It's like, well, why did they do this? It's like to secure the bag. Why did this government essentially align itself with drug cartels? To secure the bag. You know, it's the same thing. Why did the U.S. invent a war against indigenous populations to essentially try to wipe them out? To secure the bag.
Back to how there was a huge money grab for the land that the Sioux were sitting on, that they were trying to kick them out of, basically. Is that correct?
Yeah. There's gold in them there hills. The white man wants it. The rest of the world found out. It is inevitable. The white man's coming. There's going to be a problem. So, obviously, the Lakota Sioux either have no interest or cannot, or both, of adhering to this decree. They start moving west in anticipation of a fight happening. As they start pushing west, they start gathering other allied native nations or people along the way. This is the waning years of Manifest Destiny. The native populations have all been pushed essentially to the west coast or pushed on the reservations. This is the final throes of these natives' ways of life. So there is an element of come with me and we'll fight it out with the white guy one last time, right? Not all of them. There is not a unified stance on that amongst all native populations, but the Lakota Sioux Nation is very large, and as they start picking people up and moving west, the U.S. Army decides to try to find them and intercept them. By doing this, they use 3 different columns of infantry units from 3 different places to come at 3 different angles. So they have a pretty good idea of where they were, where they're going, kind of how they were moving. We think we can catch them in a general area. The goal then would be to contain them, round them up, and force them onto reservations. It's not necessarily to kill them. And the worst fear that the U.S. has, or the U.S. Army has, the worst outcome could be the Lakota Sioux run and get away. So you got to keep that in mind as we talk about the tactics and actually like what happened and why certain decisions were made. You know, they're most concerned about people getting away. So as this is happening, on June 5th, the Sundance is held by the Lakota Sioux, which is one of the most important festivals of the year. And Sitting Bull, who is perhaps the most famous Lakota Sioux chief in history, he is widely known throughout the entire nation at this point, if not the world. He's a very famous figure. He is the spiritual leader of the entire Lakota Sioux Nation. He performs a ritual dance where he cuts 50 pieces of flesh from his own body. He dances and performs his ritual until he is physically exhausted and collapses. Upon wakening, he describes a vision that he had of a large U.S. Army contingent invading their camp, but the horses that they rode in on and the soldiers were upside down. And this meant that a great victory was going to be had. So this entire camp that is moving west and gaining people as it moves west is now rallying around this spiritual guide. Like, there is a fight. Everyone knows there's a fight coming. It's just a matter of when and how. But now there's a huge sense of confidence. This is about 3 weeks before the battle actually takes place.
So what you're saying is that they had this festival that was a few weeks prior, but kind of predicted that there were going to be things happening, more or less.
Yes, and not only that, that the natives would be victorious. The first clash between native warriors and this U.S. outfit happens on June 17th. It was called the Battle of the Rosebud. This is significant for Custer's unit because this was a different column, and Custer's unit never found out about it. The cavalry units encountered this native camp and were driven back. It wasn't as significant in terms of loss of life, and tactically speaking, it was probably a victory for the U.S. cavalry technically because like they did inflict a lot of casualties on native warriors, but that U.S. cavalry unit ended up being driven from the field and didn't get word or never sent any word to the other units. Custer's unit is still moving under the assumption that they haven't been discovered yet. Now we're talking June 24th, one day before the battle. Custer's native scouts from a place called the Crow's Nest, which is a peak on a mountain range overlooking the Little Bighorn River, spots a massive horse herd, estimate about 15 miles away. They see dust and they can kind of make out the horses moving. It just, they know what it is, and they can tell it's the largest herd they've ever seen, they've ever heard anybody talk about. They tell Custer this on sunrise of June 25th, and they're warning him, not only is there a lot, this is the most that we have ever seen or anybody has ever known about. They also note that, hey, we can see your cooking fires. So they had gone on a scouting patrol ahead of Custer's main unit, and they turn it around and they can see the cavalry's smoke from their fires. So like, if we can see it, they can see it. So we're in trouble. A extremely important tactic of U.S. cavalry at this point is speed and surprise. When you lose surprise, you are in danger of also losing your speed. So there's some panic that starts to set in now. Like, okay, we might have been had, but Custer still doesn't believe his scouts. He actually goes to that point and looks over and is essentially like, I don't see what you're seeing. And they're telling him, trust me, it's there. As they continue moving, the 7th Cavalry finds what is now known as the Lone Teepee, with a dead Sanzark warrior that was wounded at the Battle of the Rosebud that took place, the week earlier. Again, the 7th Cavalry did not know that battle had happened at this time, so they just come across a collapsed teepee all on its own with a dead native warrior in it, and they have no idea why.
How far away was the Battle of the Rosebud?
I think it's like 30-ish miles. It's pretty far. It's within the same geographic area, but in terms of being able to communicate back and forth and get it's too far.
It's still a day worth of communication, at least, is kind of what it comes down to.
You're probably right. Yeah. Also, the area that these guys are marching in Montana is largely unknown to anybody in these units. It's essentially like sending this expedition force to Mars, right? These units at the time, the average age of these U.S. units is in their early 20s, and about half of them are immigrants. So it's people that, in order to get citizenship, essentially joined the military right as they got to the U.S. Never have seen any area like this. No one really inhabits out here. You're on your own. So that's another thing when you look at the landscape, how terrifying this landscape is. If you can delete all of the highways and railroads that are there and things like that, and remove anything that looks man-made, and put yourself in the shoes of anybody that was there, native or U.S. cavalry, it's essentially having this giant fight on the moon. No one's coming. And you have to bring everything you think you need, all your food, all your ammunition, all your water, and as you continue pushing into Montana, all that stuff becomes sparse. So the other thing that's happening with the 7th Cavalry as they follow this native village is the native village is consuming the resources ahead of them. mostly by feeding their horses. So the US is unable to have their horses graze as they move because the natives have already used it. So you've got a native village that is self sufficient, well supplied, using the resources ahead of a US unit that has to schlep all their shit with them on fucking donkeys and mules. Horses are not eating. The people are not really eating. They're eating like hardtack and fucking biscuits. Water is very scarce. There are rivers, there are water, but it's not like being in Minnesota where you're just going to trip over a little stream everywhere you go. And there is a huge demand for it with all of these people. So you're starving, you're thirsty. It's the end of June in the beating sun of Montana. These guys are in a bad way, and they've been in the saddle for days on end because they know they're closing in on this village. They can see the hoof prints, the footprints, the drag marks of the teepee poles. They know why all the grass has been eaten, right? And they can tell there's a lot. The foreboding thing about finding that lone teepee is that there's a quote by one of Custer's native scouts. It was either by a Crow scout named Half Yellowface or potentially Custer's most trusted scout and interpreter, an Iroquois named Bloody Knife. We'll get back to Bloody Knife. Bloody Knife is a very important character in this story. One of these guys supposedly told Custer, "You and I are going home today by a road that we do not know." And that was translated through Mitch Boyer, who we talked about a little bit earlier in the recording. The native scouts knew exactly what was going to happen if they charged into this village. They didn't know exactly how many people they were up against, but they knew they were fucked. And they're trying to get this message across that we have to wait for the other columns to catch up. Custer has been known throughout his entire career, and if you guys are interested enough, you can look at it at your own about Custer's battle record through the Civil War. He's a national celebrity at this point because he was the youngest breveted general in U.S. history, and was known for being extremely aggressive in cavalry charges in the Civil War. He has a very long pedigree with that. So his mind is on the worst thing that can happen is all these natives can get away. I don't want any other unit to go into this battle. I want mine to do it. So we're going to go.
He's attacking this thing with some bravado, is what's happening.
Yeah, that was very conducive of his personality. He was a very braggadocious guy. He would actually wear, like, his uniform would be out of spec because he would just wear what he wanted. He was known for wearing a buckskin coat, which is actually how native warriors identified him. And he was also known for having, like, beyond shoulder length, curly blonde hair. The name that the natives called him was Long Hair. They called him One Star for the brevet general rank, or Long Hair. So they knew about Custer. Again, he was a national celebrity, and he brought a journalist along with him because he wanted to document this glorious expedition that they were on. He had aspirations of going into politics after this, and that's kind of how it worked at the time. The pipeline was West Point Military Academy and going through the officer ranks of the military, become a general, then become a politician, become president. And that really was aspirations that people thought Custer had.
So with this, did he have a good reputation with the natives, or was he more of like a target for the natives because of his status?
He was absolutely a target because of how violent he was to the natives. He is now known very famously as an Indian fighter. One of the things that happened prior to the Battle of the Little Bighorn is called the Washita Massacre, or the Battle of the Washita. I can't remember the year. I think it was 1868. So we're talking, years before this. And Custer wiped out a native village by doing a cavalry charge, charging square through the village, causing gross amounts of mayhem through the village, and then taking women and children as prisoners and shields so that the native warriors wouldn't be able to fire at the U.S. anymore. So that became the tactic. And that is actually a very important little footnote in the Battle of Little Bighorn, because the natives knew about the Battle of the Washita. Obviously, the U.S. knew about it, and there's people in Custer's unit still that took part in the Washita massacre. So as Custer is sitting on the crow's nest trying to figure out what to do, he's starting to feel like we have to go. So Custer believes that they've been made, or they're on their way to getting made. They have to go now. So remember how I said that the U.S. set out with 3 different columns from 3 different places? So Custer has 1 column, and it's about 700 men total. He has 3 major parts of this column. So there's 3 people that we need to keep in mind here. Custer, Major Marcus Reno, and Captain Frederick Benteen. Custer is the overall commander of the 7th Cavalry. He's in charge of everything that's going on here. Custer's first thing he decides to do is split his command of 12 companies into 3 different battalions. So he's going to take one, Reno's going to take another, and Benteen's going to take the third. And they're going to move in 3 different directions. Custer and Reno are going to go forward, and he orders Benteen to start scouting essentially backwards to catch up with the pack train and bring them along forward. So the pack train is all the donkeys and mules with all their shit, right? So he's getting ready to need ammunition and things like that. So he's like, you got to tell them to hustle up. Now we have to talk about these 3 people for just a minute here. As far as anybody can tell, all 3 of these guys fucking hated each other. The 7th Cavalry was extremely dysfunctional. They had personal beefs with each other. Frederick Benteen was at the Battle of the Washita with Custer and had a personal grudge against him because he felt that Custer had abandoned another unit that was in trouble. So there's some layers to this, right? So Benteen, being ordered away from the attack, believes that Custer did this as a fuck you. He just assumed Custer didn't want to involve. He's not taking this seriously. He thinks Custer's a pain in the ass, right? So Reno and Custer go forward. They start working their way along the bluffs of the Little Bighorn River, moving northwest. So they're on the bluffs over the river. The native village is below, on the other side of the river, on the flatlands. They still haven't got there. They still haven't been able to see it yet. Custer then orders Reno to split again. So now Custer's going to go continue along the bluffs. Reno's going to head down and attack the village from the south. This is called a hammer and anvil technique. So what they're going to do is get Custer north of the village as a blocking unit, as Reno charges through the south of the village, starts pushing people north into Custer's unit, and they'll be able to smash them and contain them and hopefully end the battle. Again, taking Reno as the hammer, smashing it into Custer. The key to doing this is you have to get into the village quick, cause confusion, and Custer must get to the northernmost end of the village. Those are 2 very important things to keep track of here. Now let's talk about Major Marcus Reno. Marcus Reno is pissed drunk this entire time. There have been witnesses seeing him take swigs out of his flask, and he's been slurring his speech. So you got 3 commanders that all hate each other, that don't necessarily want to listen to each other, and now the guy who's going to lead the attack is pissed drunk. Yeah, cowabunga it is.
What could go wrong?
A lot. Now this leads us to Reno's attack and the start of where the bullets start flying. At 3:10 p.m., Reno crosses the river with about 160 guys. So now he has to close the distance between where they cross the river, which is just open grassland, flat open grassland, to a copse of trees that's obscuring the village. So you can't quite see the breadth of the village. He just knows it's kind of tucked behind there. As they close the distance, they get to see the size of this village for the very first time and realize they are completely fucked.
You mentioned 160 people in this battalion. How many people were in the other battalion?
500-600 people, or somewhere in between there, that are following the rest of Custer's command up the bluffs.
So it's like basically just shy of 200 people in each of the units that was there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. For rough numbers, that's directionally accurate. But the native numbers on that side of the battle is insanely huge. So, by all accounts, this is the largest village that has ever been gathered in history. They estimate up to 8,000 people total. Of that 8,000, 2,000 being warriors. It's staggering numbers. So you got about 2,000 warriors versus about 700 cavalry infantrymen. All split up.
And all of those cavalry are they're not with each other. There's separate groups and they don't know what the fuck is happening with each other.
All split up. All moving in different directions. All with different orders. All tired, hungry, dehydrated, beaten down. Already, you've lost the fight, right? Now they're beginning to understand that they have. So as Reno realizes this, he orders his unit to stop the charge and dismount and form a skirmish line. You can think, if you put yourself in Reno's shoes as you're charging on a horse and you start seeing that you're looking at a city rather than a small little village and all you got's 160 guys, there's some panic that ensues. So why continue with a attack that's doomed? We're going to set up and start firing into the village, which is what they do. So a skirmish line at this time is taking cavalrymen, setting them up in a line, and firing volley fire at a range distance. It's effective at a range. It's not so effective when that range is closed by your enemy. The other reason why this is not so effective is everyone's on a horse. So when you order a dismount, one dude has to hold the horses for the other guys that are firing. So you lose 25% of your fighting force by dismounting. And that's what happens. As they start firing, they do inflict a lot of damage. There are people that are hit in the village. Men, women, and children are killed in these initial volleys. There's a chaos that consumes the village. Unknown to the US, the village did not know that they were there yet. They absolutely knew they were being pursued. They absolutely knew the fight was coming, but they didn't know how close the US actually was. So they had actually caught the village off guard. However, the native warriors mount a counterattack, and it's overwhelming. As you can imagine, they have a lot more people, and they have a singular purpose, which is fuck those guys. They don't really know about the other units up on the bluffs quite yet because they're obscured. So this counterattack starts descending on Reno, and they have to get the fuck out of there. So instead of retreating the way they came, they go straight towards the river and start getting into that copse with trees to try to take some shelter, but they are being overrun as they are starting to run and retreat. People are starting to fall on this initial retreat, and there are white markers on that side of the river and that side of the highway. The main part of the battlefield is bifurcated by Route 90, essentially the Pike, and the Little Bighorn River. Probably 99% of all of the markers and everything are on the east side of the river. This is all happening on the west. As they're hiding in the copse of trees, Reno meets back up with Bloody Knife. And as he does, Bloody Knife takes a round straight to the back of his head, blows his head up, and sprays Reno with blood and brain matter. It is at this point Reno falls apart and orders a chaotic retreat, essentially an every man for himself, mad dash back up the bluffs to try to make it to Benteen. And it's confusing because he orders a dismount, a mount, a retreat. People are running and scattering. There are some guys that are left behind. It's awful. And as they're being choked to the river, some of the worst casualties that were inflicted on the U.S. is at this choke point on the river because they're trying to climb up a riverbank up the side of the bluffs with horses, some on foot. They're just being absolutely annihilated on this retreat.
So, as far as the actual plan of attack was concerned from the US side of things, did they all have like a specific time or like trigger or something where they were all supposed to go at the same point in time? Or how was that determined since they were all kind of disconnected from each other at one point in time?
Yeah, so I think it was time based. So Reno goes on an attack at a time that Custer has to make the northern part of the village, and then they go because obviously they can't communicate instantaneously to order the attack. It's a good point because this is actually a good transition into what Custer's doing at this point, as Reno is trying not to die running up the south side of the bluffs. Custer is continuing to move north, and they start hearing the gunfire. They realize that Reno has started the charge. They have to go now. As I was saying before, to start this, the key to making this charge successful is Reno has to charge and continue to charge the village, and Custer must get to the northernmost point of the village to make sure that they can contain it.
So we have Custer trekking through, still trying to get to the north. We have Reno now retreating because he's not only drunk, but he just saw one of his best companions get blown up right in front of him, and he's scared. And then you have the guy's last name starts with a B, but he is still hanging out with the donkeys back in down south or wherever they are. Not quite caught up yet.
That's correct. Yep. So Reno sees Bloody Knife get his shit blown smooth off right in front of him. And there's witnesses to that, and there's multiple accounts of that blood in his face and everything. Like, that's how close he was. And yeah, Benteen hasn't caught up yet. Custer hasn't made the northern part of the village yet. But everyone's hearing the gunfire. So they're all thinking different things, right? So Benteen is actually one of the commanders that kind of commands the best throughout this situation. Like, in terms of military tactics, Benteen does a good job of recognizing, like, okay, that's gunfire. We're going to start moving. He also gets conflicting orders. So Benteen starts moving to where he can meet eventually Reno on the bluffs, but he doesn't know Reno is under that amount of fire yet. At the same time, Custer doesn't know Reno is under that amount of fire, but he knows he's got to get to the northern part of the village. So they start making their way down to the river. As Custer pokes his fucking head out and sees the village, he realizes he's in the goddamn middle of it. He made nowhere close to the northern end of the village because he had no idea how big this thing was. Or in fact, he did know how big this thing was because his scouts told him how big it was, but he didn't believe them.
That was my question, is like, how come during this, like, why wasn't there more foresight? Like, didn't they have somebody that was looking into, like, hey, here's the area that you're traversing. This is what you're going to have to do in order to get through it.
I know they had the area mapped out and there were U.S. military installations out there, but I think, like, specifically where they were was largely unknown. You know, unless you had been through there before on some sort of military movement, there was no reason for anybody to be there.
Still just new land to everybody.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And also racism. That's really a reason. Is, you know, obviously these stupid Indians don't know what they're talking about. I'm Custer. I'm the hero of Gettysburg. I'm the nation's best Indian fighter. I know what's better. That's absolutely going on.
So the information was there, it just was ignored, more or less.
Yeah. Except for the exact numbers. They had evidence of all of that, you know, that physical evidence of the land as they pushed forward, that there's a massive amount of people, but they couldn't have thought that they were facing 8,000. Right. They didn't have a concept that village would be that large.
I think it's also hard to, like, to comprehend just how much of a difference that is between what they were going in with versus what they were going up against. Like, that's huge.
Oh yeah. This is, you know, fuck around and find out for sure. You picked a fight that you can't back up now. and now it's inevitable. It's here. So as Custer realizes, oh shit, this is the middle of the village, he scribbles a note that still exists to this day that is sent back with an interpreter to try to get to Benteen. And the note reads, Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. W.W. Cook, P.S. bring packs. So what he's trying to communicate is this village is huge, hurry up, bring the packs, as in the pack train. Right? It's kind of obviously what he's trying to communicate. However, the guy he sent it with, his name is John Martin. John Martin is actually an Italian immigrant named Giovanni Martini who didn't really speak English. So, as Giovanni Martini makes his way back to Benteen, Benteen realizes there's this fucking Italian guy who can't speak English telling me he has a note from my commander who's obviously screaming at me about something. Martini, why is your fucking horse wounded? Giovanni Martini had actually had his horse shot on his retreat back to Benteen, and he couldn't really communicate like what was going like to all of this. Benteen is looking at Giovanni Martini as like a fucking idiot, right? And he's looking at this note going, okay, so I guess I'm going to keep going. I'll keep moving up. And then he meets up with Reno, and Reno's telling him, no, you have to stay here. We're getting fucked up down there. So now Benteen had a decision to make. Do I continue to double time it to Custer's position because he's telling me to come? Or do I stay with Reno and their guys as they continue to come up the hill? Benteen decides to dig in with Reno.
Were they on Bad Blood? I know that both Reno and Benteen didn't especially love Custer, but what about the relationship between Reno and Benteen?
I doubt they like each other very much. I don't know specifically what they have a beef with, but there's mutual dislike among all of them in that triangle.
It's kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend or whatever type of deal. I forgot the exact saying, but
That or you're all leaders, you're gonna work together, go get it done.
I think it's more like I don't like you, but I like Custer way worse. You know,
that's
but
okay. That's yeah. That's
but the thing is, Benteen is still a soldier, so he is being ordered by his commander to move up to his position. Benteen is not necessarily derelicting his orders so much as assessing the situation, going, we're here. We've got guys in trouble here. Obviously, there's a big problem happening. We don't know how much further Custer is. We're going to try to get somebody to him and tell him to come back with us. We'll dig in here, right? I think that's kind of the plan. So they're south of Custer's position. Now, Custer, not really understanding this at the time, is completely isolated without anybody else coming. As the counterattack on Reno starts waning, the attack on Custer starts happening, and all of the native warriors start making their way and turning their attention to Custer's unit. I had forgot to mention earlier, perhaps the second most famous native warrior in this story, Crazy Horse. You guys may have heard of him. So Crazy Horse mounted the counterattack against Reno, and when Crazy Horse entered the fight, the surge of native warriors that followed him created overwhelming numbers against Reno. Once they realize Reno has been largely handled, and they realize that the middle part of the village is now under attack by the remaining people under Custer's command, they start making their way over there. This gives Benteen and Reno, collected on what's now called Reno Hill, time to sort of dig in. They're able to reconnect with the pack train and get ready for another fight, right? While they're doing that, a party under Captain Weir heads north of Reno Benteen Hill to an outlook that's now called Weir Point. And it's another one of those precipices where you stand on the edge and you can see the entire lay of that entire region out in front of them. Weir sees a massive dust cloud in the distance, and as they start looking closer, they start realizing that it's natives on horseback circling and swirling the central area, firing downwards. They don't know for sure exactly what they looked at. It could have been the destruction of Custer's unit, or perhaps one of the units that he had split off from earlier, because there's a couple pockets of last stands. So when we talk about a last stand, that's one of the myths that is dispelled by archaeological evidence. Is like, I think the thought that comes to mind when you hear the story of Custer's last stand is, shoulder to shoulder, being cornered and fighting to the death. Granted, that does obviously happen in some respect, but really the fighting comes down to complete chaos and breakdowns of communication and chains of command and fear and terror of being entirely overwhelmed without anything you can possibly do about it, right? It's a lot scarier than just, having that last stand with all your good mates. This account is known because people that survived the battle were in Reno and Benteen's units, right? Nobody under Custer's command made it out alive. What we know about Custer's fight on his last stand hill north of where Reno Benteen Hill happened largely comes from all the archaeological evidence and natives' oral accounts. There's a massive collection of these oral accounts, but it took a long time to get them transcribed and put it all together because they didn't really want to talk about it immediately following this, right? A bunch of dead white people around, you're going to have to pay for that. So it took years of pulling all these survivors together, piecing all these accounts together. There's drawings that native warriors made these are all archived. It's really, really cool. But largely at the time, who's going to believe a native account? There was this whole sweeping propaganda campaign that happened after this all went down to instill that sense of this glorious battle, right? And I can kind of get to that later on. I'm getting a little off topic, but what we're going to start talking about here gets pretty murky because there's no U.S. eyewitness accounts to this. As Custer makes his way to the river, there's actually evidence that Custer gets fucking clapped right at the river.
So it's not. It's so funny because, like, I guess the way that it's traditionally referenced is like, there's a band of brothers that are like fighting arm in arm, back to back, with all the forces coming in around. And it's just like, nah, this motherfucker got marked by the river, just like running away.
Well, if you think about it, the sheer terror that has now befallen this U.S. unit because they've lost all advantages that they could have possibly had with the technology and tactics that they had. They are screwed against an overwhelming force of motivated, well coordinated, well trained, with a lot of combat experience, right? You're in big, big shit. So there's a native warrior named White Cowbull that gave an account of Custer's unit trying to cross the river. And he had actually seen a man in a buckskin coat trying to cross the river. He thought to himself that guy seems to be in charge. I'm going to start shooting at him. And says that he hit him. Says that he hit him in the chest and saw him, kind of get hurt. And then that's when the U.S. started pushing their way back up the hill, retreating as native warriors started counterattacking them.
Question: what types of firearms were the natives using at this point in time? Was it like equivalent?
Native warriors had a massive collection of firearms because they traded for them. They were actually given firearms as part of a treaty or a payment plan or something like that. They're in tune with the modern technology of the time. So they did have traditional weapons, the clubs, the axes, knives, hatchets, bow and arrow. They did have that. Those absolutely were implemented in this battle, and we'll talk about the insane shit that they found after this had ended. But they largely had repeating rifles and revolvers for firearms. The U.S. standardized on the Springfield trapdoor. I believe it's called the 1873 carbine and the 1873 Colt single action revolver, the Peacemaker. So it's very easy to determine on the battlefield with the archaeological evidence what's a U.S. weapon and what's a native weapon. If it's a trapdoor Springfield or an 1873 Colt, it's U.S. Everything else under the sun the natives had and fought with. But their tactics were to close and overwhelm and choke you instead of getting in a ranged fight. So they had to close the distance fast. They had shorter range weapons, but they had ungodly amounts more fire rate. So they were able to lay walls of hatred down when the U.S. couldn't from every angle. And that's what happened to Custer. Is he essentially was encircled, enveloped, and then just crushed from all sides and left with nowhere to go as they tried to run back up this hill. So all those white headstone markers, Last Stand Hill looks like a graveyard. There's just scattered up on the side of this hill where they found everybody. Archaeological evidence points to a massive amount of native fire from surrounding hillsides, and also they use these hills to their advantage by just arcing fucking arrows over it. Why expose yourself to any enemy fire when you can just lob an arrow over, and if we lob enough of them, they're gonna connect at some point. Oh, and my 600 to 1,000 other best buddies with repeating rifles are just swirling them on horses, just eating these guys up. So that all happened in the span of a time that was quoted by a native warrior as less than it takes a man to eat a meal. So they think that Custer's command was wiped out in about half hour, 45 minutes.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
Yeah. And it was all of them. So any of the other guys that they had put in blocking positions on, a little bit south, a little bit east of where they were, you can see this line of headstones kind of in an arc formation from where their position was, kind of going towards where Custer's position is. And that's some evidence that was tried to use as like, this is the last stand, that's a skirmish line. They all lined up and formed up, right? But the archaeological evidence suggests otherwise, because they're not finding U.S. fired rifle cases in those positions, which suggests they were on the run. So whether they were running from Custer's position to try to make the other one or vice versa, and just being cut down the whole time, because it turned into just a freaking rabbit shoot. Once they knew they had them contained like that, it was a feeding frenzy. So the other thing is, native warriors don't operate under a centralized command like the U.S. does. When the command structure broke down for the U.S., the guys that were fighting had no idea what to do anymore, right? You lose all aspect of command and control. Natives fought like hunters because they were. One of the, I don't know if he belongs to a certain tribe or not, but he was a representative in that Battlefield Detectives documentary that went over native weapons, like how they worked, how they were implemented and used. He described that community as being predators of humans and animals their entire lives. So there was a political structure and a warring structure to native populations. So these warriors, all they knew was fighting. That was their job, right? So these guys, they were so good at fighting. There's accounts that people witnessed them on horseback, so holding a horse with one arm, using the horse as a shield. So he's like riding the horse on the side with a repeating rifle, firing it as the horse is running.
That's badass.
It's awesome. I mean, that's how experienced and good of fighters these Lakota Sioux were. And their tactics and their use of the land and knowing how to move on the land absolutely crushed any hopes of the U.S. So one of the most scariest things that I heard that happened at this battle was, just because of how scary the landscape is, there are no trees on the bluff side, right? So there's a little copse of trees on the bottom where the river was, but on the bluffs where all of this fighting is now happening, there are no trees, there are no rocks, there are no natural formations to hide behind. It's just undulating grassland with nowhere to go. and the grass is all about chest high. So I don't know if you guys have ever walked in chest high grass before. I just did it in South Dakota on a pheasant hunt. It's like walking in that much amount of snow. You can't move. You know what I mean? You're not able to run and flee. You're bogged down in it. And then all these native warriors know how to move in the grass. So by the time they get to the US positions, they were described as, quote, growing out of the ground, because they would never see them approach. They were concealed and covered the whole time, and then would just appear out of nowhere. However, the entire time that they were coming, the US heard them because they had bone whistles, which created like a shrill, high-pitched screech. So you have this horde of trained professional killers moving on your position that you cannot see. They're going to come out of the grass at any second from anywhere that you can imagine, and you hear them screaming at you the whole fucking time.
Daunting.
And then all of these dudes knew how the natives fought too. So surviving any gunshots or being wounded on the ground meant you were going to be finished off on the ground. And that's what happened to most of these guys. There's so much forensic evidence of mutilation and hand-to-hand, like not necessarily hand-to-hand combat, but hand weapons. That guy on the documentary was describing a technique that natives used to do. They would ride up to you on horseback with a club. They would smash your arm, break your radius and ulna, like Sale did in a hockey game. Just smash it right through. And as they did that, come back around and hook you by the neck and throw you off your horse. Now you're on the ground. Now they're going to come back and beat you to death, right? That's what these guys are up against. That also plays into some maybe myths about what that means in native culture. What that really means is it's a mark of victory. So the native warrior is marking your body, saying like, I am victorious over you. We are victorious over you. Also, the belief is that your damage incurred on your physical body follows you into the next life. So not only that, it's fuck you, you're not walking. Fuck you, you're not using your arms. And if I meet you in the next life, you're not going to be able to ride your horse. You're not going to be able to use your weapon.
If I meet you in the next life, then you're in a wheelchair, immobile, drinking through a straw. Like, you've got nothing going for you.
And I'm going to kill you again. A lot of these bodies were unable to be identified because of how horrifically eviscerated they were. Custer was not one of them. Custer was found largely unmutilated. He was naked just like everybody else was because the natives stripped them of everything they had, right? Keeping it either to use, because now they have weapons and ammunition and resources, or as trophies. But Custer was found with a gunshot wound to his chest and a gunshot wound to his head. So there is some evidence that White Cowbull could have clapped Custer at the riverbed. Custer then made his way back to where he ended up ultimately being found wounded, and was most likely was shot by a native warrior. And there is a theory that he committed suicide, but there's not a real lot of evidence to corroborate that. But it is a little ironic that Custer's death was perhaps one of the least violent of anybody in that fight. Now, about sundown-ish time is around the time when Custer's unit was destroyed. We're still very early in what happened here.